Let me begin with a confession and a commitment. Like too many people, most pointedly, too many men, I confess that I have not read much fiction by women writers. Jane Pollock Michel, in her 2018 article, Why Aren't Men Reading Women Writers, said that women read relatively equally between male and female authors, while men, on the other hand, are much more likely to read male authors than female authors. Now, this reality hit author Lorraine Berry like a gut punch, as she explained in her article entitled To All Men Who Don't Read Books by Women. As a small contribution to changing this, today I'm committing to read one book of fiction written by a woman every month of 2021. Now, for today, I'm going to explore some of the reasons for this gap in my education, as well as for the erasure of women authors in the publishing industry. In doing so, I don't mean to mansplain, to condescendingly explain something to women. I'm only beginning to learn about this topic, mainly thanks to women in my life, some readers and some authors. So to my family, to many of you, to Sture Michelle, Kate Staples, and Mary Kay Zaravaleff, I'm going to continue seeking your wisdom. Before I dive into my talk, I have three caveats. The first, I have read many nonfiction books by women authors, but today I'm focusing on fiction writers. Second, in today's limited exploration of sexism in literature, I don't have time to address the many other forms of oppression faced by women writers: racism, classism, heteronormativity, and more. And third, I don't have time today to delve deeply into the dominance of gender and orientation binaries: man, woman, gay, straight, and so on. Some of the problems identified today might be solved by more acceptance of the wisdom from the queer community and queer literature. Accepting people as people without strict gender labels might be the best path forward. But now, I'm going to focus on reading women, and I'm going to start with my youth. As a young person, I didn't read many books by women. Partially, this is because of sexism in publishing, something I'll discuss later on. But it may also have been due to my preference for action books over books about feelings. My wife Maureen and I discussed this after she discovered my diary from junior high school. I didn't call it a diary, of course. Within my gendered, stereotyped worldview, that would have seemed uncomfortably feminine. Instead, I called it a journal, sometimes a log, like Captain Kirk's Star Trek log. And like Kirk, I focused on not my inner world of feelings, but on the external world. I kept a record of who I was with, what I ate, and what I watched on TV. Understandably, Maureen found my journal boring. This revelation disturbed me. Had I really been devoid of feelings as a kid? Had my romantic daydreams been shallow illusions? I mean, I pined for a girlfriend, but was that because I wanted to, through them, access the world of emotion? After all, Audre Lorde wrote that men are afraid to feel. Men who are afraid to feel must keep women around to do the feeling for them. But I had plenty of feelings as a young teen. I just didn't connect them to words. So similarly, when it came to reading, I didn't explore books about the internal landscape of emotions. I wanted books about action and the external landscape, especially sports and war. I read The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, The Red Badge of Courage, sports books, The Many Adventures of Tintin, and hundreds of superhero comic books. My friend Kate Staples experienced this dynamic raising a boy. She wrote, tongue-in-cheek, "I've tried to convince myself that there are no such things as girl and boy books. Everyone loves Harry Potter, right?" I was above such artificial forced gender identification, a construct pressed on us by society's need to categorize people. Kate watched her son grow, whether due to socialization or hormones, into a toddler who loved trucks and Where the Wild Things Are. Now, as a young boy, I loved trucks and wild things, but as I grew older, I gravitated to forms of violence both in books and in play. I mean, my friends and I, all boys, threw rocks, kicked over sandcastles, and tackled each other. The girls I knew didn't. Does this adolescent tendency to explain, does this adolescent tendency towards violence explain why men write so much about violence, war, and conquering nature? No author so captured these elements as much as Ernest Hemingway. I mean, in my education, he was held up as one of America's greatest writers, though he's been more heavily critiqued recently. As one writer for The Guardian put it, Hemingway has been accused of propagating everything from racism to the most unpleasant kind of machismo, particularly alleged sexism and what many see as strangely reverential views on war and violence, end quote. It was difficult, the article continued, to understand how a man who had experienced the front lines of the First World War could have such a romantic view about young men dying in droves and whole societies being torn apart. Now, comparing my adolescent reading choices with my wife Maureen's reading picks, she was not drawn to books about sports and war. Her choices as an adolescent offered more exploration of the internal landscape of emotions and feelings. But, and I want to be clear about this, Maureen was also interested in the external landscape. It's just that the external world that she explored didn't center violence and injury and death. As a kid, she said she wanted to be a nun or a mother when she grew up, mostly because all the women she knew were either nuns or mothers. Books offered her exciting alternatives. For example, Maureen recalls her favorite book in fourth grade was Madeleine L'Engle's science fiction classic, A Wrinkle in Time. Talk about action. 13-year-old Meg Murray rescues her father and saves Earth from an evil telepathic disembodied brain. Maureen loved that book. But only as an adult did she realize why it probably captured her so. It featured a female protagonist, a girl who was independent, brave, active, when most other children's books at the time did not. It's one reason why Maureen, like many other girls, also liked Nancy Drew, created in the 1930s as a female counterpart to the Hardy Boys. Maureen loved Nancy's independence, that Nancy drove her own car without any complaint from her boyfriend, Ned Nickerson, who was happy to ride shotgun while assisting Nancy in her sleuthing. But while most books that were called girls' books actually featured docile characters, and boys' books tend to feature brave and independent and active boy characters. Why is that? One reason is because women authors have been pressured to write girls' books. Louisa May Alcott was pushed to write what some consider the most famous girls' book ever, Little Women. This work was about sisterly love and domestic peace, and it made her famous, but Alcott didn't enjoy writing it. In her May 1868 journal, she explained that her publisher, quote, wants a girl's story, and I begin with Little Women. I plod away, though I don't enjoy this sort of thing. Never liked girls or knew many except my sisters, but our queer plays and experiences may prove interesting, though I doubt it, end quote. Alcott did manage to resist one request made by her fans. They wanted the female character Jo to marry her neighbor friend Laurie and live happily ever after. But Alcott resented that women were assumed to have to marry to be complete. And she wrote, I won't marry Jo to Laurie to please anyone. Alcott herself chose not to marry and was criticized for choosing spinsterhood. Women who don't marry are often portrayed in our culture as antisocial and suspicious. Independent women were often targeted because of their power. Independence let them escape the clutches of autocratic husbands and cruel employers. Powerful women often have frightened men, and that's the theme of a book called Women Who Read Are Dangerous by Stephen Bowman. It analyzes 70 pieces of art featuring the scandalous portrayal of a woman engaged in, wait for it, reading. Bowman explores, quote, how a woman with a book was once seen as idle or suspect, and how women have gained autonomy through reading. Chapter titles in that book indicate what positive qualities reading can nurture for women. Chapters were about blessed readers, enchanted readers, passionate readers, self-confident readers. If literature can open up the world to women, science fiction can do so on steroids, so to speak. And maybe that's why, for so long, science fiction has been guarded as a men's club. But thanks to writers like Margaret Atwood, Ursula Le Guin, Octavia Butler, the sci-fi world opened up to women. Octavia Butler spoke often about how science fiction is, quote, a world of possibilities, a world held too far out of reach of women for too long. As women gained access to the law of nature bending science fiction, young women could read science fiction and say, I see myself there. All this is why I commit myself to reading women authors in 2021, to support their place in our culture and to honor the struggle against patriarchy in publishing. So let's look more closely at the repression of women's literature. This is clear. Many with anti-women attitudes and gendered assumptions, are gatekeepers at every step of the publishing process. Men dominate senior faculty positions. Most literary agents are men. Most editors and publishers are men. Most book reviewers are men. Unsurprisingly, men outnumber women on conference panels, and literary awards are given to more men than women. Out of the 110 Nobel laureates in literature, women have received only 14. My friend and my writing coach, author Mary Kay Zaraviloff, helped organize reading events at Politics and Prose and with the Penn Faulkner Foundation. She constantly had to point out the clear gender bias evident in the selection process. And this bias runs throughout the industry. Mary Kay explained that certain literary journals, national newspapers, and writing conferences don't break a sweat about including a representative number of women. So it should surprise nobody that, as Betsy shared with me, men dominate the greatest book lists. In the 100 greatest books of all time, out of the 100 listed, only 13 are by women. In the publication Best Books from Modern Library, only 9 out of 100 are authored by women. Men get to say what storytelling is supposed to look like, even though women are great storytellers, like Madeleine L'Engle. In her A Wrinkle in Time, my wife's favorite book as a kid, it won the 1963 Newbery Medal and is considered a classic, but was turned down by 26 publishers before finally giving the opportunity to shine. So think of how many books by women didn't make it to the light of day. How about Margaret Atwood? I mean, she knew, as she put it, that a word after a word after a word is power. And she used her power to critique male control, oppression, and misogyny. In 1957, as an 18-year-old student, she was feeling limited by professors who said, according to Atwood, such things like boys were headed to the professions and girls for futures as their wives. Atwood rejected their prediction, prevailed against literary patriarchy, and called it out as intentional, not simply the result of innocent ignorance. To her, men did not just not know about women authors, they didn't want to know about women authors. Atwood explained, quote, ignoring isn't the same as ignorance. You have to work at it. In The Handmaid's Tale, she showed how hard men worked at it. I mean, this terrifying futurist dystopia about sexist control of reproduction and of women's bodies became popular again after blatantly sexist Donald Trump was elected. And you wonder, did sexism help him get elected by appealing to the sometimes obvious and sometimes hidden misogyny in our culture? Many women that I know said that both Trump's election and reading Handmaid's Tale triggered trauma over male abuse of women's minds and bodies. And reclaiming power was part of the healing effort in the Me Too movement. Atwood wrote about how women of her generation were particularly oppressed. In a 1998 Harper's article by Francine Prose entitled The Scent of a Woman's Ink, she describes how the hostile male-dominated literary world of the late 1900s put up with misogyny. It put up with comments from Ernest Hemingway and Henry Miller and Norman Mailer, all who seemed almost proud of their anti-woman attitudes. In speaking about talented women, Mailer offered this nauseating diatribe that may trigger some trauma, and I apologize, I almost thought about not reading it. Mailer said, "I doubt if there will really be an exciting women writer until the first whore becomes a call girl and tells her tale. At the risk of making a dozen devoted enemies for life, I can only say that the sniffs I get from the ink of women are always fey, old hat, quainty goisy, tiny, too dyke-like psychotic, crippled, creepish, fashionable, frigid, out of Baroque, manquille in mannequin's whimsy, or else bright and stillborn. Since I've never been able to read Virginia Woolf and am sometimes willing to believe that it conceivably may be my fault, this verdict may be taken fairly as the twisted tongue of a soured taste, at least by those readers who do not share with me the ground of departure that a good novelist can do without everything but the remnants of his balls." Yuck. Having to deal with such infantile explanations of literary sexism couldn't have been easy, but that was the nature of male hierarchy in publishing. It's this kind of wretched machismo that harassed Atwood and other women writers. Octavia Butler took on this machismo-laden patriarchy. She spoke about the human tendency towards hierarchical thinking that fueled not only sexism in literature, but also social intolerance, violent conflict, climate devastation. So these are more good reasons for me to read more women writers. Max de Haldevang wrote an essay entitled "To Be a Better Ally, I Gave Up Reading Books by Men" for 2019. Now, de Haldevang decided to support feminism by acknowledging what bell hooks called the white supremacist capitalistic patriarchy. De Haldevang wrote, "The system holds that straight white men are the social norm, and to help himself out of the norm, he turned to women's writing." Margaret Atwood says that she attacks patriarchy by shining a light on it. Through the fictional world of The Handmaid's Tale, she illuminates the misogyny and sexism in our actual world. She explained, quote, "Writing has to do with darkness, a desire or perhaps a compulsion to enter it and with luck to illuminate it and to bring something back out to the light." It's as if Atwood goes through the darkness to get at the light. And she didn't feel that she could afford to fail either, because she said, quote, "War is what happens when language fails." For the final part of my talk, I want to have some examples of powerful women writers. So I'm going to start a few centuries back with Juana Ines de la Cruz. Born in Mexico in 1648, Juana was a child prodigy, winning awards for her writing from the church. Instead of being trapped in a marriage with a controlling man, she chose sanctuary. She retreated to a monastery so she could write. She wrote about philosophy, music, poetry. She became fluent in Latin and Nahuatl and built the largest known library in all of Spanish America. But when she began to write more pointed essays about religious authoritarianism and sexism, she lost favor from the church. As explained in the book Women Who Wrote Dangerous Things, the crime Juana Ines committed was being cleverer than men around her and daring to suggest that everyone could have a relationship with God unmediated by the Catholic patriarchy. Soon there were rumors spread that she was a witch and that her writing caused natural disasters. Harassed by the Inquisition, Ines avoided torture by apologizing for writing on secular topics, explaining that it was only because, as a woman, she was too dumb to comprehend otherworldly topics. This ruse worked for a while, but she was eventually forced to sign a confession in her own blood. The church sold her collection of books and scientific instruments and burned her writings. Thankfully, copies of her writings were discovered in the 1950s, and she was raised up as the first feminist in the New World. She inspired a generation of writers and philosophers. The poet Octavio Paz said, "It is not enough to say that Sor Juana's work is a product of history. We must add that history is also a product of her work." Maybe she inspired the poet and playwright Mercy Warren, who 150 years later was a feminist of the American Revolution period. She exchanged letters with influential colonists, including Abigail Adams, John Adams, Martha Washington. And Warren advocated for a Bill of Rights. John Adams, her literary mentor, encouraged her and said that God Almighty has entrusted Warren with the powers for the good of the world, which in the cause of providence he bestows on few of the human race. Hamilton proclaimed Warren proved that, quote, in the career of dramatic composition, at least, female genius in the United States has outstripped male. But we don't hear about Warren much in our courses in college. Now, maybe Juana Ines and Warren inspired Rebecca Harding Davis, who powered the modern labor movement with a short story called Life in the Iron Mills, published in 1861 in the Atlantic. It was the opening salvo, in fact, of a lifelong activism in defense of African Americans, women, indigenous Americans, immigrants, workers. But let me move on to contemporary times by speaking about a playwright and an activist, Storée Michel. Some of you know her. Last week, she shared with me her sense that women writers approach the written word more organically or more viscerally, that they tend to be more sensorial, focused even on the sound of the words. Recalling Toni Morrison's opinion that language in the universities is overly conceptual, restrictive, and limiting, Storée appreciates how many women use language more freely, like choreography or like music. I also learned from Storée how new language is opening up literature to people outside of heteronormative traditional frameworks. Because for much of the past, books written primarily by straight white men and taught in universities seemed foreign, not just to women writers, but to queer folk as well. If you're not a white straight male, you have to expend great energy reinterpreting the canon in order to get inside of the literary characters, to see yourself in that work. Jose Esteban Munoz wrote a book called Disidentifications. And in it, he describes a literary world dominated by straight men, where women and queer folk have to strip away the maleness of the characters just to see themselves in the stories. And having been oppressed by gender for so long, women are skilled at degendering fiction in general. One reviewer explained that Munoz looks at how those outside the racial and sexual mainstream negotiate majority culture, not by aligning themselves with or against exclusionary works, but rather by transforming these works for their own cultural purposes. Disidentification creates new perspectives on performance and activism that can benefit all of us. And as more queer writers gain mainstream recognition, literature can become even more inclusive and empowering. So thank goodness women and queer authors no longer stay silent. Audre Lorde has written extensively about the dynamics of silence and the power of language, how women sought safety through silence and sanctuary. And that's one reason why women chose to go into convents, to escape abuse by men. Lorde explains, quote, "I write for these women who do not speak, for those who do not have a voice because they are so terrified, because we are taught to respect fear more than ourselves. We've been taught that silence would save us, but it won't." Janet Sternberg's 1992 book, The Writer and Her Work, is full of essays about reclaiming voice and about being seen. In the preface, Sternberg explains how a woman who acknowledges her creative powers goes against deep prohibition. Sternberg says, quote, "To acknowledge publicity, to acknowledge publicly the satisfaction of serious work, The fact that one is doing it is to face a host of inherited fears and real dangers, loss even of creative potency. For women have learned to punish self-claims with self-negation. The essays in this book cut across prohibitions. They are about being visible, end quote. Being visible in a patriarchal world is hard work for women. To survive and flourish, self-care is particularly important. As Audre Lorde emphasizes, women for too long have been told that their role is to care for others, to sacrifice their future for the good of their husband and children, or for society as a whole. To resist this, to care about their own well-being and future, is a part of liberation. Lorde writes, caring for myself is not self-indulgence, it is self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare, end quote. So finally, in this pandemic year of racial unrest, let me raise up Toni Morrison, who will be the first author I'm going to read in 2021. As I said at the start, I cannot address intersectionality adequately today, but clearly multiple forms of oppression weighed on Morrison. In expressing gratitude, author Britt Bennett explained what she loved most about Morrison. Bennett said, Morrison's not interested in writing about white people. She writes about Black communities, and whiteness will linger or influence the story, but her characters are thinking about other Black people, their problems, their own lives. That notion of decentering whiteness from a narrative was important to me and felt realistic to how I experienced life as a Black woman, end quote. Maya Angelou cited Morrison as a lifesaver. Angelou said that, quote, in the midst of my misery, I wrote a letter to Toni Morrison to say thank you. Thank you very much for not only seeing me, but seeing me as an African-American woman and loving me. This is what this woman has done through 10 books, loving, respecting, appreciating the African-American women and all that she goes through, end quote. Morrison did what so many women have done, called out the misogyny that oppressed women in the publishing industry and in life. Morrison understood, as she put it, that oppressive language does more than represent violence. It is violence. Does more than represent the limits of knowledge. It limits knowledge. In conclusion, thank you to my friend Story Michelle and to all the writing women I know. Thank you to the trailblazers, Juana, Ines, Mercy Warren, Toni Morrison, many others. Thank you for demanding an end to limitation. As individuals and as a culture, we need the voice of women and the voices of others who challenge male patriarchy. We need the power and the creativity of all who read and write. We need a diverse and revolutionary literary world. I've limited my knowledge by not reading women authors. I confess that this limitation was self-imposed through passive acceptance of a system that privileges male writers. I hope to counter this in a modest and long overdue commitment to reading women. Thanks very much.